All right, hey again, everyone. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some pitfalls and problems that are common in research questions. I've done this for quite a while now, and I've seen a lot of students' research questions, and I've seen many ways in which they can sort of go awry early in the process. And of course, we want to try to diagnose some of those potential problems before they become more serious. And if you think about it, many of you have probably come to this process with this a kind of very natural evolution, the evolution of a research question. And so I'm just going to give you an example of a very successful one before we delve into some problems that might arise as you make that research question into a reality. And so, for example, we might begin with this stage that I've hopefully gotten you to at least try to do some in your exploration of the course content so far, is this kind of discovery phase where you really have a very broad discussion about just a general subject, a subject area that's interesting to you, or maybe you've made an observation about political reality, or really just empirical reality in general that cries out for an explanation. And so, for example, you might ask yourself, man, I've noticed, I've lived in Baltimore for, five years, going on 6 years. Man, Baltimore is a really unequal city. I drive around and, I drive from some parts of the city and things look really fancy and there's like a lot of money clearly in those places. And then I drive to other places and it's pretty clear that there's not a lot of money in those places. And I'm really interested in why that is. Why is Baltimore so unequal? And more broadly, I wonder why cities in general, right? If we think about our population, we're not just thinking about Baltimore at that point. We're thinking about a broader phenomenon so that we can make some sort of causal comparison, right? Why do some cities have a lot of economic inequality and why are some other cities relatively less economically unequal? What causes variation, right? This is the topic formation stage. And you can see that I do it almost reflexively because I've been trained to do this over my training as a researcher. Again, it might take us a couple weeks to get from here to here if this is our first time doing it, right? But an observation like this, Baltimore is a really unequal city. What's going on there, right? Can eventually be sort of melted down into that topic formation question that we discussed in the previous modules. What explains variation in economic inequality in American cities? And so now we've got a population here. We're going to look at different cities and we're going to try to figure out, right, here's our topic, economic inequality. Is economic inequality higher or lower in different places? I certainly think it is. And so that means also that this thing is potentially variable. It varies from one place to another. But of course, we're not done yet. And this is the stage that we're at right now as we think about this causal link. So why, right? Let's try to answer that question as effectively as we can, using the kinds of deductions that we're able to make, either from our understanding of the academic literature on a subject, which maybe you have some exposure to that, maybe you don't. It sure seems like Baltimore has a long history of redlining and housing discrimination, and so maybe you think to yourself, I heard something about this. I saw some kind of special. PBS special about redlining, or I heard some professors talking about it, or I saw a lecture on it, from a visiting scholar at UMBC. Maybe this is what's going on. Maybe this is part of the story. And so then immediately, once we've brainstormed this causal link and we've used the topic formation heuristic to create a good topic, all of a sudden we have all the components needed to fill in these blanks. What is the effect of historical redlining on economic inequality among American cities? And so again, we're thinking carefully about the population. We can delineate what that population is. We're thinking about economic inequality. Can we measure that? I mean, probably, right? We could think about ways that we could measure economic inequality, and it's likely that there's some statistics out there on how unequal cities might be. This one might be harder to crack, though, right? Historical redlining. We would need to figure out if it's possible to measure that. Although, of course, we have the historical record, and so that's something that we could potentially turn to do good research. And in fact, this is the evolution of a research question that is not hypothetical. Actually, I call your attention to Lawrence Brown, who's a professor who actually wrote a book very recently called The Black Butterfly, which is the sort of subtitle here I think is very, very telling. It's called The Harmful Politics of Race and Space. And it is specifically about redlining and its effect on all sorts of different outcomes in American cities today, using Baltimore as a motivating example in the book. And so it's a really great book, something that just came out just a few weeks ago. I got a pre-order copy recently, as professors are wont to do, and it's exactly that, right? It's this exact evolution of a research question led to a really great book investigating that exact link. So it's not just undergrad researchers that are going through this exact process. It's also professional researchers who are doing this and writing books that, again, at their core, have that exact same process. But of course, since this is our first try doing this, things can go wrong, and they can go wrong quickly. And I also want to just mention that for professional academics, pitfalls in the research question process can arise quite quickly and easily as well. And there are many times when I and professors all across our campus and other campuses will think, and they'll have a shower idea. They'll be taking a shower and have this moment, right? Whoa, my gosh, I have a great research idea. And they'll sit down to put it on paper, and they'll realize they got to crumple up the paper and toss it away because there's been some problem in the research question process that means that it's just not going to quite work out. It's not going to make for a great research question, and they've got to start over. So this is not just first semester researchers. This is professional researchers for which these pitfalls do emerge as well. So don't feel too bad if you need to take a few cracks at it, right? Some pitfalls are exactly the same as those that might plague us during the topic formation stage. For example, we might have a research question that is too broad or too specific. And the real reason for that might be that our independent variable concept or our dependent variable concept, or both, are either too broad or too specific, or one's too broad and the other's too specific, or vice versa. Even also our population might be too specific in a way that limits the degree to which those independent and dependent variable concepts can vary. Maybe this is something that verges on description. Maybe it's something that's more like how many birds instead of what's the relationship between one thing and another thing. Another sort of threat that really arises here is the tautological link, where our independent variable concept and our dependent variable concept are basically the same thing. More on that in a moment. Also, we can have an issue where this becomes really normative, where it becomes clear that our research question is asking a question about whether something's good or bad and not about describing a relationship. And then, of course, this is a really big threat and something that is very hard to do without significant experience. You might encounter a research question that ends up being not tractable. And just to give you an example for myself, I might, just recently have come up with a great idea about analyzing the, relationship between some kind of economic information that exists in media, and then the kind of coverage that comes out of specific news outlets in terms of their coverage of those economic developments. So maybe the stock market goes up, what happens to this specific news outlet in terms of the coverage of the stock market that they publish. Now the problem is it might not actually be tractable. I might be interested in this question, just broadly defined, but it might not be tractable if there's no historical record or no database for which all of those media sources like transcripts or articles are stored. So if I can't gain access to the data, how could I possibly study the relationship? Because my DV concept relies upon the population being, news stories in this specific news outlet. So I need to reframe this in a way that's either not about that news outlet because you can't gather data on it; it's just not available to researchers, and to broaden this to maybe think about other news outlets for which it's possible to gather the data, or I just need to scrap it all together and start from scratch. That's something that happens, but again, it's not until you start to really dig in and look at where data are and whether or not those data are available to researchers that you might end up coming to a screeching halt in this process. And that's also where I come in, where I'm able to, before we get to the research collection process, guide you a little bit and say, I don't think this is tractable based on my experience, and we can have a conversation about where to go from there. So if you're worried about this, if you're concerned that your research is not tractable, just send me a quick email or wait for the first assignment, and I'll definitely give you some guidance on that part of the process. Again, a lot of this is just exposure to having done this over and over again in the same field. And that's one of the differences between professional scholars and people on the street who are making these kinds of observations. The real pitfall, though, that I want to talk about today, the biggest problem, I think, in this stage particularly, is that often students will propose research questions that aren't theoretical, that don't have some kind of theory that's behind them. That is, they don't have an existing sort of, at least just gist of an argument as to why these two things go together. And you might be saying, but wait a minute, we haven't gotten to the theory chapter, right? Professor Edson, we haven't gotten to the theory chapter. I'm not supposed to know about theory yet. I haven't read that yet. That's fine. We're going to talk about the sort of criteria for good theorizing later. It turns out that it's more complicated than what I'm going to talk about now. But for now, really what we want to know is, do we have a good story? A very basic, right? A basic conversational story as to why the research question makes sense to you. And if you can't articulate that story, then maybe your research question is not appropriately theoretical. And so here are some examples. What is the effect of bee populations on the Democratic vote share in American counties? Now, like, again, for the sake of argument, you could maybe be like, okay, look, people who like are beekeepers, who like have backyard apiaries, are going to be more liberal than not beekeepers because they're like environmentalists and like they want to like love the earth or something. Like, okay, maybe that's like extremely tenuous though. Like, I don't buy it fully. Also because if you think about it, people who have apiaries, like bee populations in their backyards who have honeycombs, that's not like the majority of bees in the United States, right? Most bees are either in the wild. So that's going to be a huge threat to our theory about backyard bee populations, right? And also, there are massive bee producers that exist in very specific places in the US where, there's huge apiaries and they produce most of the honey in the United States. And so, of course, those places are going to have gigantic bee populations. So this idea about like a few people have bees in their backyards and that's what's driving this relationship, like, I just don't buy it. And that's the kind of conversation you want to have, right? Does this make sense, really? Like, if we think about it for more than like a second? The other question is, what is the effect of economic conservatism on support for libertarian candidates in U.S. congressional elections? Okay, so we could measure this, right? We could measure the economic conservatism of individuals in a place, right, in congressional districts. We could figure out what's the average amount of economic conservatism, and we'd be able to figure out if libertarian candidates win more in conservative places. But did you really need to do a research project to figure that out? Like, libertarian candidates espouse economic conservatism. They probably are going to run in the first place in economically conservative places, and they're probably going to win in economically conservative places and not in liberal places, right? Libertarians are never going to win in like AOC's district, but they might win in rural Oklahoma. So that's, again, this is a research question that to me is not particularly interesting and even verges on tautology. And that is, you're measuring the same thing with both IV and DV concepts. And then finally, this is another research question that we could consider that to me is not tractable. That's a potential problem. So what's the effect of Mars colonization on soft power among countries with space programs? Okay, well, that's good. We've looked at soft power as a DV concept. We're interested in explaining soft power. We want to look at specifically just countries with space programs. We have a well-defined population. But our IV concept is whether or not you've colonized Mars as a country. And to my knowledge, and again, my knowledge is limited on this subject, nobody has planted a flag or raised a colony, no less, on Mars at this moment. Maybe, some people have been reading too much sci-fi and they've lost track of what's in the future and what's in the present. But nobody's colonized Mars yet. And so there's no variation in this variable. It's not measurable and it's not comparable. And as a result, we're trying to look at something that's in the future and we're unable to use any existing data to answer the question. And so that's the baseline thing, right? If you can answer the question, right? A, does your answer make any sense? B, right, is it interesting? And C, can we even answer it in the first place? And I think if you can sort of pass those basic checks, I think you're going to be all right. So again, good research questions. You want to propose an interesting relationship, and a good heuristic for that, a good shortcut to think about that is you've got a hunch, like you think you know the answer, but you aren't like 99 to 100% confident that it's going to happen, right? There has to be at least some uncertainty in whether or not it's actually true in order for it to be interesting. You also, again, this asterisk here to indicate this is super hard and you should ask me if you're running into problems here. You should be able to anticipate the availability of data. So again, there's no data on which countries have or haven't been to Mars. Essentially the answer is 0. Similarly, there's no data, about how good the Mars habitat gear is of each space race country. Like we don't have the available information because that's in the future. And then also you want to make sure that your research question is not normative in certain ways. That is, it's not about what's better or worse. It's not about what's good or bad. It's about trying to understand the direction and strength of the relationship. More on that in a couple of modules. So again, I hope that this broad discussion, has helped you to narrow the research question that you're devising in the course. And I certainly look forward to providing you with the feedback that you need to make sure that this research question is fantastic. It may take you a couple of shots to get a great research question, but I'm very confident that all of us are going to be able to succeed in doing so in just a short while. So that's all for this module. I wish you the best, and I look forward to reading your research questions. See you soon.